October 1942. The heart of Guadalcanal is shattered. Japanese commanders are certain Henderson Field is ruined for months. Their bombardment wiped out 90% of Allied fuel, cratered every runway, and left the infamous Tokyo Express supply lines wide open. The clock is ticking, and without this airstrip, the entire Solomon Islands campaign teeters on collapse. But what the enemy didn't foresee was a battle not of guns, but of resolve and ingenuity, and the impossible engineering feat that would defy every expectation. Here is how the countdown to disaster became the turning point of the Pacific War. Henderson Field sat at the center of Guadalcanal like a loaded gun pointed at every Japanese supply run through the Solomon Islands. From this battered strip, American planes could strike ships running in the narrow waters known as the slot, routes the Japanese called the Tokyo Express. Every night, destroyers and transports raced down these channels, bringing troops and ammunition to reinforce their foothold. If Henderson stayed silent, those convoys would go unchallenged. If it roared back to life, the entire Japanese strategy for the Solomons could unravel. The airfield's reach stretched more than 500 miles, covering the sea lanes between Rabaul, New Guinea, and the southern islands. Japanese command documents show how vital this projection was. Control of Henderson meant control of the skies and the waters below. For the Allies, losing it would sever the lifeline to Australia and leave their marines stranded. For the Japanese, destroying it meant a clear path for reinforcements, a chance to tip the balance and reclaim Guadalcanal. After the October bombardment, Tokyo's planners calculated that the Americans would need weeks, maybe months, to restore the runways and fuel stores. Their reconnaissance flights returned with images of cratered coral and burned-out wreckage. They believed the Cactus Air Force was finished. The sea lanes would be open, at least for a while. Orders went out to send more troops and supplies down the slot, confident that no American planes would rise to meet them. Every hour that Henderson Field remained grounded, the odds shifted. Japanese convoys, previously forced to run at night and risk air attack, could now operate with daylight freedom. The entire campaign hung on whether the Americans could defy the timetable set by their enemy. The next move would decide not just the fate of one airfield, but the outcome of the Solomon Islands campaign itself. Rain fell in sheets, turning the coral airstrip into a quagmire. The surface, once hard-packed, now gave way under every step. Bulldozers and graders bogged down, their treads swallowed by the muck. Each crater from the bombardment filled with water, deepening into muddy pits that threatened to trap even the heaviest equipment. The coral base, crucial for drainage and stability, had fractured under the shock of nearly 1,000 14-inch shells. Smashed into rubble, it could no longer support the weight of trucks or rollers. Every attempt to move machinery risked another breakdown. Few spares were left, and what tools survived the shelling were already worn thin from months of hard use. Supply shortages haunted every repair effort. Fuel was nearly gone, with over 90% of the stored aviation gasoline lost to fires. Replacement parts for engines and pumps were nowhere to be found. Cargo nets brought in by hand from the beach held only the barest essentials. Even the skilled labor needed for such a job was in short supply. Many of the engineers and Seabees assigned to Henderson Field were already sick, weakened by relentless heat and waves of malaria. Medical records from the period show infection rates climbing above 1,000 cases per week. Some men collapsed at their posts, feverish and delirious, while others pressed on through exhaustion, knowing there was no one left to take their place. Night brought its own kind of terror. Any work after sundown meant digging and hauling under the threat of renewed bombardment. Artillery flashes on the horizon signaled another round of shells, forcing crews to abandon their machines and dive for cover. Each morning revealed new craters, fresh wreckage, and the same impossible task. The mud, the heat, the disease, and the constant threat of attack combined to make the job seem hopeless. Yet the clock kept ticking, and the fate of Guadalcanal hung on whether these obstacles could be overcome. Coral became the lifeline for Henderson Field's survival. Bulldozers and trucks rolled out to the nearest exposed coral terraces and shallow pits, stripping away chunks of white stone from the coastal plain and riverbanks. Operators worked in teams, scooping up raw coral and hauling it straight to the ruined runway. There, the process took on a rhythm: dump, spread, grade, and roll. The first step was to fill the deepest shell craters with coarse coral and any gravel or clay available, packing the holes in 6 to 8 inch layers. Each lift was bladed flat, then compacted with whatever rollers could be salvaged, sometimes a captured Japanese steamroller, sometimes heavy US tandem drum machines. Operators watched for just the right moisture, knowing coral locked together best when slightly damp, not waterlogged. Too dry and the surface would crumble. Too wet and the heavy rollers would bog down, punching ruts into the soft subgrade below. Once the base was stable, crews added a top course of finer coral, crushed and screened to about 1 inch in size. This upper layer was graded with a 12-inch crown down the center line, encouraging water to run off the surface and away from the landing zone. Each pass of the roller pressed the coral tighter, smoothing out ridges and forcing out air pockets. In some spots, operators made up to 10 passes per lane, checking for soft spots and loose stones by feel and by eye. When the rollers left only faint tracks and the surface held firm under a loaded truck, the strip was judged ready for traffic. The sequence repeated across the field, with teams leapfrogging from one bomb scar to the next, always racing the next downpour or incoming shell. By layering and compacting the coral in this way, engineers transformed a shattered, muddy wasteland into a surface strong enough for fighters to attempt landings, sometimes within hours of the last shell burst. Fuel handlers moved quickly among the wreckage, piecing together a supply grid from whatever survived the fires. With 90% of the aviation gasoline gone, crews rolled empty drums out to the field's edge, linking them with battered lengths of pipe and salvaged hose. Hand pumps, some borrowed from trucks or siphoned from wrecked vehicles, became the lifeline for every aircraft that could still fly. Each drum was rationed, measured out by the gallon, and guarded night and day. Logs from the period note flow rates as low as 20 gallons per hour, barely enough to keep a handful of wildcats fueled for patrols at dawn. Night work never stopped. Without proper floodlights, engineers and Marines relied on vehicle headlamps and makeshift lanterns, sometimes just flashlights taped to shovels or helmets. Crews rigged up edge lighting by stringing bulbs scavenged from trucks, powered by portable generators that sputtered and coughed in the rain. When shellfire forced everyone to ground, the lights were doused and men dropped into foxholes. As soon as the barrage lifted, work resumed, picking up tools and shovels from the mud. 12-hour shifts became the rule, with teams rotating from the line to the rear for a few hours of rest. Fuel handlers, engineers, and Marine riflemen shared the same rhythm: work, eat, dig in, repeat. Anti-aircraft gunners covered the perimeter, scanning for bombers or low-flying Zeros. In the darkness, the field was a patchwork of shadows and glimmers, every man focused on keeping a single lane open for takeoff, no matter what the next hour brought. A single Wildcat taxied to the end of the newly patched strip, engine idling as ground crews cleared away the last loose stones. The pilot, visor pulled low, checked his instruments and throttled forward, eyes fixed on the uneven ribbon of coral ahead. Every crater filled, every patch rolled, but no one could promise the surface would hold. Rain still beaded on the canopy, and the air hung heavy with the smell of diesel and wet earth. Marines crouched at the edge of the field, watching in silence as the fighter gathered speed. Wheels bounced and skidded, the nose dipping as the Wildcat hit a rough patch. For a heartbeat, it looked as if the gear might collapse. Then the tires bit, and the plane surged forward, tail lifting. The pilot kept the stick steady, trusting the work beneath him. When the Wildcat settled onto the far end of the strip, brakes squealing, a cheer broke out among the men. Mechanics and engineers rushed to check the landing gear, hands running along the struts, searching for cracks or bent metal. The surface had held. Against every prediction, Henderson was open for business again. Bulldozer teams pushed forward before sunrise, headlights flickering in the mist as they widened the battered strip. The original Japanese runway, barely 150 feet across, had to handle more than single-lane fighter landings. Now, every extra foot meant safer takeoffs, easier landings, and room for bombers arriving in battered formations. Crews worked in overlapping shifts, some just off night watch, others fresh from a few hours' rest in muddy tents. Their routine became almost ritual. At first light, engineers fanned out with shovels and graders, walking the length of the runway to check for new craters, soft spots, or loose coral. Each bomb scar from the night's shelling was measured and mapped. If the damage cut into the main lane, teams dumped and bladed coral by hand until a grader could finish the job. The goal was always the same: restore the full 150 feet of width, crown the center line for drainage, and compact the surface until it held under a loaded truck. By mid-morning, the field was ready for another round of sorties. This relentless dawn to dusk cycle kept Henderson Field not just alive, but growing stronger, each day pushing the limits of what the battered runway could handle. Henderson Field's battered runway didn't just reopen, it exploded back into action. Within hours of the first Wildcat test landing, the Cactus Air Force was launching sorties at a pace that caught both friend and foe off guard. Pilots from VMF 121 and VMF 223 taxied out at dawn, engines coughing on rationed fuel, each flight a gamble on the still uneven coral below. By midday, dauntless dive bombers from VMSB 132 joined the fray, their crews briefed in muddy tents and sent up to hunt Japanese ships threading the slot. The field's battered surface shook as Avengers and Wildcats clawed into the air, sometimes using only 100 feet of patched coral before wheels left the ground. Japanese commanders, relying on reconnaissance photos from October 15th and 16th, saw only cratered runways and burned-out fuel dumps. They assumed the airfield was silent, its aircraft gutted by shell fire. But as the sun climbed, the first wave of American fighters swept low over the sea lanes, catching a Tokyo Express convoy in broad daylight. Bombs and machine gun fire tore into the lead destroyers, forcing the convoy to scatter. Reports from the Japanese 17th Army that night described confusion and surprise. Supply ships that should have landed unopposed now limped away, some burning, others slipping beneath the waves. Allied intelligence tallied at least 3 transports sunk or crippled in the first 48 hours after repairs, with pilots claiming dozens of enemy casualties and disrupted landings. On the ground, word spread quickly. Marines dug in along the Lunga perimeter heard the rumble of engines overhead and cheered each returning aircraft. For men who had spent days under bombardment, the sight of Wildcats and Dauntlesses circling back to land was proof that the field and the campaign were far from lost. Even the engineers, still patching craters at dawn, paused to watch the squadrons return, their fuselages streaked with salt and mud. Letters home from pilots and ground crews spoke of pride and relief, the sense that Guadalcanal was no longer a waiting game, but a fight they could win. Japanese planners, forced to revise their own timetables, began to realize that the airfield's quick recovery had turned the tide. Each day Henderson Field operated meant another day of lost supplies, another convoy forced to run the gauntlet. The Americans' ability to launch sorties, sometimes more than a dozen in a single morning, became the heartbeat of the island's defense. For the men on both sides, the message was clear. Henderson Field was back, and every hour it stayed open brought the Allies closer to controlling the Solomons. Manuals and field notes from the Pacific Campaign still cite Henderson Field as a turning point in military engineering. The lessons drawn from its battered coral runways shaped doctrine for decades, setting a standard for rapid, resilient airfield construction far from home bases. Post-war engineering texts point to Guadalcanal as the first proof that local materials, crushed coral, scavenged steel, even battered fuel drums, could be turned into runways strong enough for combat aircraft, even under constant threat. The coral template, first hammered out in the mud and chaos of Henderson, became the model for dozens of Pacific airstrips that followed. By the end of the war, Seabee and Army engineer units had built or repaired more than 100 major airfields using these methods. Each one a testament to the speed and adaptability first demonstrated on Guadalcanal. This doctrine did not rely on centralized control or elaborate supply lines. Instead, it empowered small, autonomous teams to act on their own initiative, adapting techniques to the terrain at hand. Field manuals from 1943 onward highlight the value of decentralized decision-making, what Seabee commanders called A-team autonomy. The idea was simple: give a handful of skilled engineers the authority and tools to improvise, and they could keep an airfield alive in almost any conditions. This approach spread across the Pacific, from the coral flats of Tarawa to the volcanic soils of Iwo Jima, shaping the way the US military thought about expeditionary construction. The memory of Henderson's restoration is preserved in more than just technical manuals. Unit citations and award texts from the period honor not only the speed of the repairs, but the ingenuity and grit of the crews who made them possible. The Navy Unit Commendation awarded to the 6th Naval Construction Battalion specifically cites their work on Guadalcanal, filling craters, laying coral, and keeping the strip open despite disease, bombardment, and exhaustion. Memorial markers on Guadalcanal today bear the Seabee logo and the motto, "Can Do," a reminder of the men who turned disaster into opportunity. These lessons echo in modern engineering doctrine. The coral runway, once an improvisation born of necessity, is now a case study in every military engineering school. The emphasis on local materials, rapid compaction, and autonomous field teams remain central to expeditionary construction worldwide. Henderson Field's restoration proved that infrastructure could be as decisive as firepower, and that adaptability, more than any single machine or weapon, was the true force multiplier on the battlefield. Today, rapid runway repairs remain vital to military operations worldwide. NATO, for example, routinely trains for airfield recovery under fire. The lesson endures: control of infrastructure means control of the fight. When impossible odds meet human ingenuity, predictions fall and new realities are built overnight. The battlefield is still shaped by what can be rebuilt, not just what can be destroyed. What would that mean in tomorrow's conflict?